Some of you regulars know that I love Fiddler on the Roof, and it is the story of Tevye, who has a small bit of dairy cattle, and he makes his living for his family of his wife and 5 daughters by milking those cows and then selling the milk in the small town of Anatevka where they live. The play takes place at the very beginning of the 20th century in Russia, and everyone there is obviously of extremely modest means. You can tell from the beginning there's a handful of people with resources, but that most of them live day to day. It is a very difficult existence. Early on in the play, Tevye, and of course he's the moral center of the play, is out pulling this sort of like a wheelbarrow that's got the urns of milk in it that he's delivering to people, and it breaks down. I mean, it's kind of rickety to begin with, and the mule that's with it can't seem to do what it's supposed to do. It's just such frustration with all of his poverty and all of his difficulties. And so Tevye stops there, and he has this really wonderful relationship with God. He speaks with him very regularly during his work. He's a very holy man. So he says, "Dear Lord, you make many, many poor people. Of course, I realize it is no shame to be poor, but it's not a great honor either." And then he adds, "Would it be so terrible if I had a small fortune?" That segues into him singing the song that's well known from the production, "If I Were a Rich Man." The song, "If I Were a Rich Man," in there basically is him imagining what would happen if he had the wealth that he thought would make his life easier. He spoke about if he was a wealthy man, he wouldn't have to work hard, and he could sort of go through his day with greater ease. He imagines that his wife could wear much nicer clothing and would have servants, and they would have to do the work for her. He imagines that if he was a rich man, he could spend time every day in the synagogue with the holy scriptures and the learned men, which he cannot do because he's a hard laborer. All of these things he says, if he were a rich man. The end of the song is really nice. The very last verse of it, he says, "Would it spoil some vast eternal plan if I were a wealthy man?" Well, we hear the parable of the talents, and if you're like most of us, when you first come across it, it immediately strikes you about money, it strikes you about wealth, and it strikes you about the challenge of it. We never think there's enough of it. If it's been given to us, we have to do something with us, and most of us are just different versions of Tevye the dairyman. We have an existence where we think we have enough to get by, but it's difficult, and of course in pandemic times it's why even more difficult. And so we hear that parable, and it's rather this cautious thing, am I giving enough money for whatever it is, to the church or to this, that, or the other thing? And it's a source of consternation for people that hear it. It's coming at the end of Matthew's gospel, where he's speaking about the approaching judgment. My goodness, it's hard enough to think about the final judgment than to add to it financial woes. If I were a rich man, it would be so much easier. We would tell ourselves, and then that parable would be of no problem to us at all. In fact, we could be the one giving the talent to others. When we hear the word that the one servant gets 5 talents, one gets 2 talents, one gets 1 talent, because you and I live, whether we like it or not, in the 21st century, that word talent doesn't mean anything to us. In fact, talent basically means, like father has the talent of speaking without notes. I don't have any other talents, but I'm pretty good with that particular talent, I guess. And each of you think about that type of talent, a skill, something that we have. And I think there's some truth in that in the sense of the term talent. But we need to know when Matthew's using it, talent would have meant currency to the people in the first century where this story was first told. A talent represents, however, 15 years worth of the worker's daily wage. One single talent is an enormous amount of money, which makes 2 and 5, well, enormouser, if that were a word. So that basically, even the one with the 1 talent, sounds like he gets the least, doesn't it? Is given something as extraordinary, that it has a huge amount of monetary value. And small wonder that the person that has it worries about it. The first 2 invest their talents, they trade in them. And as a result of the productiveness of their investment and their trading, they're actually able to multiply. The one with 5 gets 5 more, the one with 2 gets 2 more. But the one with 1 is fearful of all of this. The one with 1 is fearful of the risk. If anything were to happen to this talent, if it were to diminish in any way, shape, or form, he would have to return it less than it was when it was given to him, a risk this person's unwilling to take. So he does what makes the greatest sense to him. He buries it in a hole in the ground where it simply can be returned to its owner. Sort of like a savings account. They make so little money that basically they never grow, but you get this idea that it is safe. When the master comes to settle accounts, it's a rather surprise, a turn of phrase, that he rewards those who invested the talent and made more with it. But then the one who simply produces it back to him, safe and sound the way it was, earns the master's wrath. We wonder why he didn't damage the talent. He got back exactly what he gave him. Do your own darn investing if you want to do that. Don't saddle me with your things that I have to go out and risk. But you see, what happens is the master asks each of the servants to risk the gift that was given to them, that the gift that was given to them was extraordinary, and it was so big that it couldn't possibly have come from their labor. It couldn't really possibly be their responsibility, that they were to take this gift and do something with it, to invest it, which would involve risk-taking. And it's the hardest thing for anyone to take risks when they're risk-averse. Matthew's gospel is all about the danger of being risk-averse. It's going to end next week with the parable of the sheep and the goats that talks about the end of times and those who were not willing to risk the grace that they had received to provide the goodness that the poor need will face the wrath of God. So it is all about investment. It is all about risk. But guess what? It's not about money. Well, a year ago this time, I embarked on a discernment journey with our parish leadership. The full parish leadership is 3 different councils. The pastoral council, which is the visioning body for the parish, the finance council, which are the accountants for the parish, to make sure that we know exactly what our financial status is and to advise me in all those financial matters. And then our development council, which is charged with how do we grow these parishes and sustain them so that long after you and I are dead, they will continue to be the beautiful places that we were. I brought all 3 councils together, and we were dealing with an existential challenge. The parish school has been here for 115 years had become a financial burden. If you were to look at the simple finance sheets, they're not simple, they're rather complicated, but if you were to look at them, what you can basically tell was a declining asset. It was an enormous amount of risk. This school, because it's in a neighborhood that doesn't have very many local children, and certainly not very many local Catholic children, lacks a steady stream of enrollment, which is a challenge for any school in order to stay somewhat financially sound. And over the years, it became more and more difficult to get enrollment. The bigger, flashier schools that offer more services, that have more modern buildings, all these things are attracting the students who would be the closest to us. We've always known it was a risky proposition to keep a school going in a neighborhood that doesn't seem to be able to sustain it. So looking purely as if it were only money, the decision would be rather clear. That even though we've been in the business of educating children for 150, the ministry, I should say, not the business, of educating children for 115 years, the time had come to take that money, take no further risk, and do something with it. I asked the council not to assess the financial status, because that's what the finance council was there for, and they worked very hard over the years to help us see the risk and to see basically what it is that we're dealing with. I asked all these 3 councils, however, to take the month of December to go home and pray asking God not what to do with those balance sheets, because who knows what to do with those balance sheets. I never did understand them. But to pray to God and ask, what are you asking of us? What ministry are you entrusting to us? What is it that you want us to do? And that after Christmas, we could gather together and share the fruit of our prayer, our thinking, and our reflection. When we did gather in that first week of January, the situation had only gotten worse, not better. And the easy solution would have been to say, let's close the school and be finished with it. Well, you know the rest of the story. Our visitors don't, but the rest of you do know that we didn't close the school. You might say that we gambled, although that would be an incorrect verb. We didn't gamble. We actually chose to invest the gift that had been given to us so that it could continue to bear fruit. Of course, we didn't know. How could we have possibly known? In January, there was going to be a pandemic. I think if we had known that, we would have all pulled the plug. That would have said, that's the straw that broke the camel's back. There's no way we can make this operation go. Let's fold up our tent and go home. But we didn't know that. God did not reveal that information to us. On the basis of what we discerned, we made a courageous decision to continue to invest in the children that have been entrusted to us. Well, it was a couple of weeks ago when I was having the morning mass here at St. James, as we do at 8:30. When we finished the mass, I went out to my car, out in the parking lot. And our visitors may not know this, but the Catholic schools in Louisville are in person with social distancing and all kinds of requirements, bubbles, I mean, you name it. I haven't been in the building since the school year began. We try to keep it as hermetically sealed as we can. The kids are, the grades stay together and they don't ever mingle with the other students. It's all very carefully orchestrated. It's mind-blowing what it is that we do. All of a sudden, being small turns out to be an advantage because it is easier to space the kids. It's easier to kind of make things go together. Anyway, after the mass, I went out to my car, and from a safe distance, I looked on our playground, and the 4-year-olds were out on the playground doing exactly what 4-year-old children do. They were running around in circle. I could never quite figure this. All the playground equipment, and they were making laps around it, and it was exhausting for me just to watch them run like that. And then shrieking. I was like, how could such small bodies make such a loud amount of noise? But there they were, shrieking and running and kind of doing what kids do with playground equipment. They were climbing on, they were playing with it, and it suddenly struck me. These children who a year ago were in uncertain circumstances, and then the pandemic came, are in a safe place. They're actually in a place where they can, at their age level, simply play on the playground, that they can socialize safely with each other. Inside that building where I could not see, hermetically sealed in each of the classrooms, the grades are doing what kids need to be doing. They're sitting in the classroom with in-person classroom instruction. The public schools can't do this because they're too big, there's too many kids. It's just simply too unsafe. But being small, we're actually able to do that. I learned from our principal, for example, that our students are beginning to improve in their math scores, for example. That's always been a challenge for us. We're seeing that when the kids are in a structured environment, they suddenly have a capacity to learn. They also have an ability to socialize. This is so important for children at this age level. Why am I telling you this? Because looking at the kids on the playground, I recognized finally, although I think I knew it before, but I really had my confirmation. It was never about the money. It was never about the balance sheet. My God, you'd have run for cover if you looked at that balance sheet. I'm probably scaring some of you, but it is that scary when you look at it. But the whole reality was that these children had been entrusted to us, and they were entrusted to us not as a financial asset. They were entrusted to us as a spiritual asset. As I talk to our committees, the work of a church isn't to be profitable, although it can't work very long if it doesn't at least pay its operating costs. The work of a church is not to be profitable. The work of the church is the salvation of souls, and in that way it is profit. Profit is in grace, and see, God dispenses all the grace the way the Master does in the parable that we just heard, and that grace is of inestimable value. But we can't help ourselves. It's usually about the money, about the resources, about the immediate moment, and all of us having a fearfulness about taking on additional risk. And discipleship is risky. We have to risk everything, every grace that's been given to us, and we have to trust in the God we cannot see, we cannot hear, we can't even be certain that the God is there. We have to trust in all of that to lead us ultimately to the kingdom. So we find ourselves here celebrating the Eucharist this morning in the midst of a pandemic when many people are afraid to come here, and praise God, you're sitting safely distanced from each other. Everyone's wearing masks. We're doing everything we can to make this as safe as we possibly can. We're live streaming it for those that physically can't be here but can at least participate on a nominal level with the worship that we're doing here. And in every Eucharist that we celebrate, the principles of the parable of the talents are demonstrated to us. As I frequently would tell our finance committee, now they do look at every expense. God love them. That's what they're there for. The one thing they don't spend too much time worrying about is the amount of money we spend buying communion wafers and altar wine, both of which are ridiculously cheap, in the grand scheme of things. And so those elements, which are essential for the celebration of Eucharist, have very little economic value, very little monetary value. No risk in buying those, even if the balance sheet is bleeding like it sometimes is. And yet, any Catholic person of faith believes that once it is consecrated, they're receiving the sacred body and the precious blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. And you and I can't even put a monetary value on that because there is none. You see, in the Eucharist, we receive the perfect gift of grace that comes from Jesus Christ on the cross. You see, he was the only one on the cross that could give us the gift that would free us from the bondage of our sins. No normal, ordinary human person could ever do such a thing. The sacrifice is so perfect that absolutely nothing is added to it, which means when you and I receive it, it's completely free of charge. The way those servants in the parable received a talent, suddenly in front of them was 15 years worth of money. The other was even a larger amount of money. My goodness, as if it had simply fallen from the sky. Don't you see? That's how the grace is imparted to us. And it's hard for us because we're challenged, and this is in God's order of things. He just thinks your life is uninteresting if it's not filled with challenges. And so because we have challenges, we worry, is there enough grace? Will there be grace? Am I going to make it through the day? These are all anxieties that are part of our world, and yet the reality is God is super abundant with the grace that he gives. And the purpose of this grace isn't monetary security. It's not financial security. It's not any other kind of security you and I can think about. It is the salvation of our souls, which turns out to be the only thing that matters. In my second term of office at Ascension, the place where I served for 13 years before I came here, Archbishop Kurtz came out to install me the second time. And he learned something when he was there that our maintenance supervisor there, Jim Grider, that's their version of our John Allison. Utterly indispensable people. The place cannot exist without them. And Jim Grider was the same way. I mean, just he's still there. But one of the things he did on his own was he operated what was called a lottery pool. He was very into the big super lottery, and most people, we don't have the wherewithal to go buy tickets and do all of that. You would give him $20 when he would tell you when to give it to him, and he would always make sure you were in the drawings, no matter what. Elaborate records were taken. You knew exactly how much shares you had, if the lottery hit, all of it. It was really all done with the lottery pool. Well, Archbishop learned that I was in the lottery pool, so we were right there in the sacristy before Mass for confirmation, and he says to me, he said, "Gary, if you were to win the lottery, would you leave us?" I was kind of taken aback by the question. That is the question, isn't it? You win all that money and you don't have to work anymore. And I just smiled and looked at him. You know me, I love a good quip. I smiled and looked at him and said, "Oh no, I would stay right here and become the largest thorn in your side." I still love the line, and I really did say it. But the reality is I wouldn't leave, not because I could rest, relax, and see the world. It's because this ministry is my life. It's everything to me. Even with all the money in the world, I'd love to find out what that might look like. The ministry is there whether I'm poor or rich. In fact, in my older years, I began to learn I'm wealthy beyond my imagination. The people who I serve, the grace that we all share with each other, the experiences and encounters with God, and his invitation for you and I to work in the salvation of souls, the most important of all work, is such a huge privilege. Each Eucharist reminds us that unlike Tevye, who worries about being a wealthy man, and even in Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye learns that he has a wife that loves him, and he has 5 daughters, and the richness of family, and with all the things that happen throughout that play, in the very end, they remain a family with a somewhat secure future as they move towards America. He learns he's a wealthy man in many ways that he didn't think as well. And I would say for you and I, it's the exact same thing. each Eucharist reminds us of the awesome, incredible grace of God, which then means you and I are wealthy, rich, beyond all our imagination.